The study of leadership in the Synoptic Gospels both assumes and amplifies the conclusions of my earlier chapter, Leadership in New Testament Greek Concept Study. And so let me summarize briefly, if I may, the findings of that earlier chapter so that we can all be together as we move on to discuss leadership in the Synoptic Gospels. Now, in that earlier chapter on leadership in New Testament Greek, we discovered that there is no single Greek word that is translated leader in the same way as, for example, the Greek word didaskalos is translated teacher. Now, that's not true in ancient Greek, where the word anax, from the ancient root wanakt, means leader or lord in the general sense of one who exercises authority over others. But that word is never used in the New Testament. What that means, practically speaking, is that a simple word study will not likely produce the results we either expect or seek, at least in part because the New Testament lacks interest in leadership as the exercise of power. I'll say more about that in a moment. And so, to study leadership in the New Testament is not as easy as doing a simple word study. What is required is more a concept study or idea study than a word study. Rather, we must employ modern linguistic analytical techniques to identify and isolate the semantic group of words that can be or have been translated by the English words leader, leadership, and their cognates in an attempt to get a fix on the semantic freight this concept bears in the New Testament. Once that semantic freight has been established, one can then study New Testament leadership in places where leadership language is not used at all, but where the semantic freight associated with the New Testament concept of leadership is clearly present, such as narrative, where the author employs such things as plot, setting, and character interaction as communication strategies to make his point about the nature of leadership. We'll look at one of those in a moment. In trying to get a fix on the concept of leadership in the New Testament, then, we employed semantic analysis as pioneered by Jean Nida in the service of isolating semantic word groups related to our inquiry. Modern linguistics employs semantic analysis to identify and isolate two different aspects of Greek words, namely, what semantic company they keep and what shared semantic space they occupy. The former tells us which words to study, the latter isolates and identifies the core semantic freight borne by words thus associated. In this way, we can identify the semantic field or domain of the Greek words that can be or have been translated into English as leader or leadership. Now, when we did this, we found that when we looked at Greek words which keep semantic company with the English concept of leader or leadership, two different, even competitive, semantic domains emerged: guide and govern. The New Testament appears to show little interest in the concept of leadership in the semantic domain govern, except as it comes in for critique. In the New Testament, leadership is best understood as gathering around the English concept of guiding, or to use the biblical and pastoral image, shepherding. Come at it another way, the study of leadership can be approached phenomenologically from three different perspectives. Ontology, what a leader is, that is, what innate or inchoate skills, qualities, or traits he or she possesses. Methodology, what a leader does, that is, how the leader leads. And teleology, to what end does the leader lead. Thus understood, the New Testament has no interest in leadership as ontology, what a leader is, that is, what skills or traits he or she possesses. Presumably, because in the New Testament, leadership is not a human quality. Rather, it is a matter of vocation, that is, calling, as the call narratives in the Gospels make clear, not a set of skills or traits people possess or can acquire for themselves. Methodologically, leadership in the New Testament is a matter of guiding rather than governing. Teleologically, in the New Testament, the goal or end of leadership is always the kingdom of God. That is, leadership in the New Testament is not merely a matter of getting people to do what you want them to do. Rather, in the New Testament, a leader is a servant of the kingdom of God. More precisely, in the New Testament, leadership is pointing persons to and guiding persons toward the kingdom of God. It is this last aspect of leadership in the New Testament that is best illustrated in the narratives and stories of the Synoptic Gospels, and which was the subject of the eponymous chapter. If the Gospels are narratives about Jesus, then the meta-narrative, both behind and beneath those narratives, is the kingdom of God. That the kingdom of God is the essence of the preaching and teaching of Jesus, and the conceptual framework of the Gospel Weltanschauung requires no defense. That the kingdom of God in the Gospels in particular, and in the New Testament in general, is an eschatological reality would be embraced by the vast majority of New Testament scholars. Though to be sure, some New Testament scholars would prefer to interpret the word eschatological more temporally, while others more spatially. Most would agree that when the New Testament talks about the kingdom of God, it is referring to an alternative reality, or an alternative society, as John Drain has called it. Disciples in the kingdom of God are they who have caught sight of this alternative reality, and even though they yet remain in this reality, they already here and now live their lives as citizens and residents of the alternative reality. They are in the world, but they are no longer of it. To be sure, this concept of the kingdom of God as a countercultural alternative reality, both in the world but not of it, is a challenging one to grasp. Perhaps an illustration will help. Imagine, for the sake of argument, that the room in which you are reading this chapter is the only room in the whole world, and the people with whom you occupy this room, the only people in the world. There are no windows, there are no doors in your room, hence you have no concept of anything outside your little world. Indeed, the word outside does not exist in your language. You would be forgiven in such a situation for believing that the room and the people with whom you occupy it were the entire universe. However, completely unknown to you, there exists another floor above your room where other people are living other lives and doing other things. You are not aware of their existence because you have never been outside your own little world, but they are there nonetheless. Now suppose a hole were to be torn in the ceiling of your world, the floor of the world above, so that for the first time you were aware of this other world just above you. And suppose some in your world began to call up to the people in the room above, interacting with them, learning all sorts of strange and wondrous things, things utterly inconceivable in your world. Indeed, you discover to your amazement that the people in the room above live their lives according to entirely different rules than those which govern life in your world. In the room above, the poor are not regarded as a drain on the system, but are precious and prized. The old and sick are honored and valued, rather than being warehoused and discarded. In this world, if one makes a promise, one keeps it, even when inconvenient or difficult. And in this world, it is okay to suffer for doing the right thing. Some in the world below find themselves strangely drawn toward the world above and its customs and culture. Indeed, a few are so captured by this new world and its new way of living that even though they still live in the world below, they start to think of themselves as really belonging to the world above. Though they are still in your world, they are no longer of your world. The knowledge of the room above having broken through into the world, their world, changing them forever. That is what Jesus meant when he described the inbreaking of the kingdom of God in his life and ministry, an eschatological event. Indeed, a world-defining event so radical and revolutionary that it created a whole new community, the Hebrew kahal, the Greek ekklesia, a community of people who, having caught sight of this new world, could never go back to what they once were. Leaders, therefore, are kingdom guides, persons who, having caught sight of this alternative reality, point others to it. The remainder of the chapter explores narratives and stories illustrative of leadership as guiding toward the alternative reality of the kingdom of God. The story which perhaps is most indicative of leadership in the Synoptics is the story in Mark chapter 10, verses 35 and following, the request of James and John to occupy the positions of power next to Jesus in the kingdom of God. The story is significant in that it is the only place in the entire Synoptic tradition where Jesus discusses leadership as a subject. The setting of the story in the Gospel of Mark is heavy with meaning. Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem with the cross before him and his disciples struggling to keep up both literally and figuratively. Since Caesarea Philippi, Jesus has been speaking openly of the cross, both his and theirs, but his disciples were having difficulty fitting Jesus' conception of the kingdom of God into their own assumptions and expectations. For the third and final time, Jesus predicts his coming passion to the disciples. Mark's gospel tends to treat the disciples as foils for Jesus and his understanding of the kingdom of God. They want to follow and understand, but they just cannot bring themselves to buy in to his vision. Mark depicts this resistance and recalcitrance dramatically with a pattern that gathers around the three passion predictions in the gospel, Mark 8:31, 9:31, and 10:32. The pattern is as follows. First, Jesus predicts his passion to the disciples. Second, the disciples typically fail to get it and misunderstand Jesus' meaning. Thirdly, Jesus provides the disciples with remedial instructions, as it were, on the nature of life in the kingdom of God, the character of his messiahship, and the disposition of their discipleship. The story of the request of James and John functions in this narrative structure as the second component of this tripartite pattern, namely, the misunderstanding of the disciples. The disciples' misunderstanding, which Mark depicts as blindness, is highlighted by two provocative narrative juxtapositions. First, Jesus' prediction of his suffering and death is immediately juxtaposed by the request of James and John for the power seats in the kingdom of God. And second, James and John's blindness is made to stand in bold relief by the fact that the story of their request is immediately followed by the story of Bartimaeus, who as a blind man sees better than they, and in fact becomes a true disciple, willingly and freely following Jesus on the way. The request of James and John then offers a teachable moment about the nature of leadership in the kingdom of God. The story falls into two sections. The first, Mark 10:35-40, depicts the request of James and John to occupy the places of power, right and left of the throne in the coming kingdom of God. Presumably, they sense an opening for themselves to gain the ascendancy over Peter, following Jesus' put down of Peter in the previous scene, in which Peter reminds Jesus of what they had left behind for the kingdom and consequently wants to know what's in it for us. Jesus responds by saying that the kingdom of God is not about coming out on top, but many of those who will be first will be last, and the last first. The second section, Mark 10:41-45, is the only place in the Gospels where Jesus overtly addresses the idea of leadership. In so doing, Jesus stands the world's notion of leadership on its head. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, rather, but to serve and to give his life a ransom, litron, for many, Mark 10:45. The revolutionary character of the kingdom of God is an alternative society, another world. The room above is evident in the dismissive reply with which Jesus dispatches the request of James and John for leadership as power. But it is not so, he says, among you. Indeed, there is a fundamental disconnect between life in the kingdom and life in this world, Jesus asserting that the former, not the latter, is the real world. You know that those who seem, the Greek dokeo, or appear to rule over the pagans, Greek ethnon, dominate, that is, they lord it over them. Their leaders, literally their great ones, or perhaps one could translate it, their so-called great ones, like to push their weight around. There is no escaping Jesus' point. By calling the will to power pagan, ethnon, Jesus asserts that it is antithetical to the kingdom of God. Moreover, his point is that as a leadership principle, the will to power cannot be redeemed. It must be abandoned. We sometimes think that if we could just get the right people into power, we could fix things. Jesus, however, asserts that there are no right people. It is the will to power itself that is pagan and anti-kingdom, and it cannot be redeemed irrespective of who wields it. Jesus makes two other points in the story that impinge on the topic of leadership in the kingdom of God. The first is that service, Greek, diakoneo, is inherent to the kingdom of God, not an optional accessory to it. By extension, one could extrapolate that Jesus meant to suggest that ministry or service is somehow inherent to discipleship, consequently to salvation, not an option beyond it. Secondly, leaders in the kingdom of God are not leaders who also happen to serve as an act of either deigned or feigned humility. Rather, in the kingdom of God, leaders are servants who also happen to lead. Indeed, in an alternative reality where the metric for greatness is service, servants will have to lead. And so to summarize, the New Testament has no interest in leadership as the exercise of power and authority over others, except to critique it. The concept of leadership in the New Testament is the kingdom of God, an alternative reality visible only through the eyes of faith. As such, New Testament leaders are in this world, but they are not of it. Leadership in the New Testament is more a matter of calling than capacity, vocation than virtuosity. And finally, New Testament leadership is about guiding, not governing.